So here's how far the Axis powers got in Europe, and here's how far they got in the Pacific. How are they forced back? And how is the war going to be won by the Allies? Well, part of this is the fact the U.S. and the USSR have way more industrial and manpower than the Axis powers. They have just too much. I mean, for instance, the U.S. automobile industry provides 4 million armored vehicles. The total war thing coming together. Now, before the U.S. had gotten involved in the Pacific side, they do go to Europe first. So just so you understand the timeline of things, before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. had what's called the cash and carry policy that would supply Britain with guns, basically, and war stuff materials. The Lend-Lease program in 1941, the U.S. government gave destroyers and other war goods to Britain in return for the lease of naval bases. So basically, everybody's helping each other here. Now, after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. really can't do a mainstream effort in the Pacific Ocean first because they lost so much at Pearl Harbor. So they turn their forces to Europe, where they are going to try to work to push back the Nazis and the Italians. And it's mainly the Nazis they got to push back. So let's talk about the Soviet side first. The Soviet side, they have fought off the Nazis. The Nazis never got to Moscow. They got really close, but never did. And Stalingrad is at Sparta. So the first really large-scale victory against the Nazis. They had been stopped before at Leningrad with the siege of Leningrad that was unsuccessful. But then, 1944, the Soviets go on the offensive. They go into Romania, Hungary, Poland, and they reach the suburbs of Berlin in April of 45. The Soviets killed around 6 million Germans. On the other side of things, first, the U.S. and Britain decided to go into northern Africa in what is called Operation Torch. You can see Operation Torch here. The British decided mainland Europe, they didn't have enough forces yet to go in there. So instead, they come around. The U.S. is involved in the war, and the U.S. comes in here. You have some French help as well, and these were French colonies. Now, this is going to be kind of controversial because after Operation Torch and they take this area, they have a question. They can either go help the Soviets in the east, or they can try to break into mainland Europe. Their decision is to try to break into mainland Europe in what is known as D-Day, the largest land invasion that has ever happened. And you can see it's called Operation Overlord, led by General Eisenhower. And this is how they break in. The Germans are overwhelmed by the U.S. invasion. The British Air Force is trying to weaken them with some nighttime raids. And then the U.S. comes in and they start. I skipped a step there. This is the attack. They set up some fake things to the east of this that would have probably been a better invasion spot, but they decide here because this will be the spot to basically, we're going to break onto Omaha Beach right here. This is probably the most famous part. Here comes the U.S. invasion. Incredibly deadly part because they're breaking into basically a fortified Europe. Now, after the U.S. is successful at D-Day, incredibly brave fighting here. The U.S. starts attacking industrial targets during the day. The British are going to firebomb things like Dresden at night, and they start going, and they're going to start pushing back. You can see here on this map, I'm going to concentrate on the blue stuff. Here's Normandy. They're going to break into, the Allies are going to come up here. This is definitely a U.S. and British force making their way up. Italy as well. Notice they don't really help the Soviets. This is all Soviet pushback. That's going to become controversial for Stalin as we move on. The Battle of the Bulge, as seen here in December 44, is the last German offensive in the war. They try to bulge through the lines, is why they create a bulge in the lines. It doesn't work. And at that point, now the march is on to Berlin. As I said earlier, the Soviets got there in April of 45. The U.S. and British forces and French forces from the west isn't that much farther behind. And on May 8th, 1945, it's VE Day. VE Day, and the battle for Berlin, which had taken place, was brutal. Hitler had committed suicide on April 30th. The Soviets took care of the body. We do not know where the body. No one knows where the body is. That was very much on purpose. And the U.S. or the Allied powers have won the war in Europe on May 8th, 1945. Now, next part, let's go back in time a little bit, and let's go to the Pacific side of things. Pacific side of things, Midway is the turning point. I'll show you where Midway is. Midway is out here of June 1942. This is the time when the Japanese Navy is in shambles. Now, the U.S. aircraft carriers were really the only thing that had survived Pearl Harbor, and that is going to play a huge role. We were also able to break the Japanese codes. They were never able to break ours. The U.S. used the Navajo language to transmit codes, so the Navajo people were absolutely paramount in the war effort. After Midway, the Japanese Navy is in shambles, and the Allies go on the offensive in a strategy called island hopping. It's to break down the supply lines of the Japanese. So instead of going for all the islands at once, hey, we're going to skip islands. And we're going to just, hey, can we take an island on the other side of that? Because then that island's not going to have any supplies left. And then eventually, the idea was, hey, we can get on path to invade Japan. Now, some things about the Japanese fighting style. It's incredibly brutal because they took a lot of their fighting style from what the samurai had. And the samurai believed in fighting to the death. And that pride that had taken place was definitely a part of this. So Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the more famous battles, are close. And you can see the dates here. They're both in 45. And they're both just closing in on Japan. Slowly but surely closing in on Japan. For instance, Okinawa saw 110 civilians died because they refused to surrender. Now, the U.S. had firebombed Tokyo in March of 45, which destroyed over 25% of the land. It actually turned a river in Tokyo, and it was boiling. And it was boiling by that point. And the U.S. has a decision that it needs to make. Are we going to use the atomic bomb, which we had developed in the Manhattan Project secretly? Literally only FDR knew about it. When FDR dies and Truman takes over the presidency, Truman did not know about the atomic bomb. Well, we developed 3 of them. One of them we test in New Mexico, and Truman has to make the decision. Okay, we have 2 atomic bombs left. Are we going to use them, or are we going to invade Japan? The estimates on what would have happened if we invaded Japan, it was 1 million deaths is usually the number thrown out there. Sometimes it's higher. I've never really seen one lower than that, but I have seen higher than that. And Truman decides to drop it. He does give the Japanese a warning that there will be prompt and utter destruction that comes upon you. The U.S. drops one on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. You can see the picture of the mushroom cloud over there on the left, and then you can also see the right what happened to Hiroshima. Hiroshima was picked because it was an industrial town for the war effort. Tokyo was not picked because it was very much more of a civilian target. Notice the Japanese do not surrender, which definitely fits with the motif that we know about them from historical grounds. So the U.S. drops there, you can see the numbers on what happened. Now I'll let you pause and read this of what happened with the battle, or with the just kind of the details of the blast itself. So pause and read this now. The Japanese do not surrender, and then the U.S. drops their second atomic bomb on Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. Eventually, the Japanese do decide to surrender. VJ Day is September 2nd, 1945, and for the first time ever, the Japanese Emperor Hirohito makes an announcement. Most Japanese people had never heard from their emperor, and he makes the announcement that we are surrendering. Now, this took this took a large toll on the people of Japan, a very proud people. And the Japanese have now surrendered. The U.S. is still the only country to have used an atomic bomb for a war. None have ever been blown up since then for a war. And we will talk more about this in class about, hey, was that the right thing to do or not? Because, yeah, it did save a ton of American lives. There's no question about that. And did save Japanese lives? Yes. But the long-term effects of cancer are definitely, and I mean, this is something that historians debate. Now, part of the U.S. motives for this, and Truman's especially, was we want to show the Soviets we have this, because the war had hugely taken on. There was definitely a split forming between Churchill down there on the right, Truman in the middle for the U.S., and Stalin for the Soviets. And they wanted to figure out what are they going to do with all this territory post-war. And they started to talk about in February of 1945 as they are really starting to win the war, and it's becoming obvious that the U.S. or the Allied powers are going to win the war. So they agree to divvy it up. They do not want to do the same thing that they did after the Treaty of Versailles. They are going to occupy Germany and divide it into four different parts. Soviet, American, French, British. And eventually, not too long after the war ends, the British, French, and the Americans are going to combine theirs into what we now know as West Germany and then East Germany. Also, they divide up Berlin. They are also going to take Japan and Korea and divide them in half, although Stalin will quickly give up their occupation of Japan. Now, one of the major points of this is that Stalin is going to promise self-determination for all those countries that he had gone back and conquered. Because let's go back to this map. There we go. Go back to this map. Remember, some of these countries are just against Stalin. And the Germans had taken some of these places from them as a result of what Lenin had given them post-World War, or to get out of World War I. Well, the relationship between the U.S. and Great Britain and France, the western part, is the Soviet Union. You need to give democracy to these people and self-determination. These people should rule themselves. Stalin changes his mind before they finalize the deal, but they're kind of stuck, and they continue. And so Stalin, who had promised that these people have self-determination, he does take it back. Takes it back from them. So the Germans and the Japanese and the Italians had complete surrender, unconditional surrender. The Pacific side is done. That the U.S. and Japan, or Korea, is going to get divided in half, and the U.S. is essentially going to work to rebuild Japan, but we can talk about that later. And once we get to the Cold War, and in the eastern side of things, Germany is split into two, and Berlin is split into two. But then also you now have a divide that forms, because you have the communist eastern side of things and the western side of things with the U.S. and Britain and France mainly leading the way. The one thing I forgot to come back to is the fact that atomic bomb, Truman, yeah, it ended the war, but it also showed the Soviets, we have this. Now, we find out later the Soviets had a person inside the Manhattan Project who stole material, or stole the plans, and are going to end up bringing them back to the Soviet Union, which is one of the reasons we will end up in the Cold War, because the Soviets will develop a nuclear weapon as well. So World War II is over, and you are left basically with two sides of things: the Soviet Union and the U.S., Great Britain, and France. Here comes the Cold War.